Good evening, everyone. We left off on page 103. They pulled up to the driveway, and nothing looked out of the ordinary, except for the 4 squad cars that had just arrived. Curie told the boys, "Wait here. Don't leave the car, all right?" They nodded obediently, but Aiden looked confused. Before they could ask any questions she couldn't answer, she shut the door and jogged up to the closest squad car, flashing her badge. "I want 2 of you on that car. If you notice any suspicious activity, I want to be notified immediately. Understood?" The police officers nodded, and with hands on their weapons, jogged toward the car to take point. Curie secured in her ear the wireless earbud that had been hanging, clipped to her shirt collar with a string. Now she could be contacted by any of the police officers. She approached the next closest squad car, and the police officers walked over to her. "I want 1 of you in the back entrance. 1 of you with me. 2 guarding the front. Understood? We're going in." "What are we looking for, ma'am?" one officer asked as they prepared to dispatch. "I honestly don't know," Curie said. "We go in preparing for at least 1 hostile. Best case scenario is that I'm about to embarrass myself," she said with a slight smile. They smiled back, slightly uncomfortable. "This is my residence, so follow my lead. If I say nothing's in a certain place, nothing's there," she said. "Okay, dispatch." They started moving. She couldn't help but feel sorry for Aiden and Patrick. She wished the windows were tinted dark enough that they couldn't see out. They could see very well that they were being guarded by armed policemen, and that people were now surrounding their house. It had to be scary. Curie pushed those thoughts out of her mind and forced herself to think like a CSI. She approached her door and didn't bother ringing the doorbell. She swiped her key through the slot and gained entry instantly. The security alarm was silent. It was not on, and it wasn't on door chime. It was dead, she saw with a quick look as she spotted a bullet hole straight through the keypad. Her stomach plummeted, and she realized her suspicions had been correct. Oh God, she thought. They moved quickly, but efficiently. They split up and covered the downstairs and upstairs separately. They yelled clear, one after the other, and it was Curie who covered the study, where Connor wrote this time of day. She entered, pointing her gun at various corners, but lowering it when she saw that no one was there. What she did find, though, sent her stomach leaping through her throat. On Connor's chair, she saw a large pool of blood that extended to the floor. A bullet was lodged in the floor, telling her it was through and through. She didn't bother calculating the trajectories right now. She didn't want to know. His computer screen was closed rather hastily and was jostled in the struggle. It had skidded out of place on the desk. At some point it registered that the police officers were waiting for her to clear. She shouted in a voice much shakier than she expected, "Clear," and continued looking around. It was then that she noticed the picture frame. It was their picture of the Irish coast, with rolling waves crashing against the rocks. It laid skewed on the floor. The glass was cracked, and blood was smeared in the tiny cracks and on the frame. On the wall where the frame used to hang, the drywall was dented, and there was blood smeared on it as well. She felt numb. How many crime scenes were identical to this one? How many times had she swabbed the blood for DNA, snapped pictures, and processed fingerprints? How many times had she collected trace, run it under a microscope, and found evidence that pointed to one culprit? These thoughts ran through her head, as did about 1,000,000 others, mostly of Connor's condition. But one very obnoxiously loud thought took precedence over all else. Not in my house. At some point that Curie could not recall afterwards, the other police officers entered the office, and she called her team in. They arrived in a matter of only 15 minutes, hovering at full speed and ready to process the scene. Curie exited the office and only then noticed the bloodstains outside that she apparently hadn't noticed before. That was a testament to her distraction, as they were obvious against the off-white marble floor. As soon as her team approached the front door, she said suddenly, abruptly, "Connor's cell phone! It should have been on his belt. I'll be right back." They didn't argue, and Curie walked back into the office where she found officers taking pictures. "Have you found Connor's cell phone?" she asked them. They looked around and shook their heads. She spun and exited, nearly running into Justin. Was he not answering it? "It just kept ringing. We might still be able to get a satellite lock on it," she said, already out of the door and walking through her front hallway. She exited her house and went straight to one of the squad cars. She opened the car's back hatch. She extracted a locating computer and started up the software. Then, using her input codes, she accessed the government's locating system and then searched for Connor O'Malley's name. She got quite a lot of hits and narrowed it down to the Connor O'Malleys that lived in her area. and then got it down to 1. She found his cell phone. Its GPS locator was sending a signal. She breathed a sigh of relief. "All right, I want a unit of officers and rescue at this location," she said to the officers nearby. "We're leaving in 5 minutes. Make the calls," she told them. They obeyed instantly, and Kiri ran back into her house and up to the office. "I have a lock on his GPS locator. I'm going with the unit to his location. You guys finish processing the scene. I'll be on my phone and on the radio if you need me." Justin frowned. "You shouldn't go." "I'm going," Kiri said in a tone that told him there was no other option. "The location's right on Butterfield and it isn't moving. They probably took him off the road." Justin nodded. "Be careful," he said. Kiri gave him a single nod and ran out the door toward the squad car. The officers reported immediately. "We've called the unit and EMS, ma'am. They're waiting for you on the corner of LaGrange and Ogden. EMS is proceeding to the location." "Thank you, officers," she said as she sent the results of the search to the nav system in the front, shut down the computer, and closed the hatch. Then she got in the car and hovered out of the neighborhood as quickly as she could. The urge to break the hovering speed limit for this situation was almost irresistible. She zoomed toward the intersection at Ogden, and the unit saw her at her signal to move out. The squad cars followed her lead, and they all sped down Butterfield toward the locator signal. They were there in a matter of minutes, and rescue had already arrived. She practically leapt out of the car and drew her gun as she carefully jogged down the embankment by the side of the road. Cars zoomed by her. The traffic wasn't bad on Butterfield now. She went directly to where her handheld locator told her to look for the signal. "Over here, ma'am," one of the EMTs directed. They walked through some trees and a strip of forest that served as a sanctuary for the nearby office parks. She noticed that the location of the phone had moved from one side of the road to the thick of the trees. That meant he was alive, or at least that he had been moved. "Right here," the EMT yelled, and a few more came running. Kiri batted some leaves out of her way and almost tripped over a fallen branch, but she was there before the rest of the officers. The EMTs started digging in the patch of woods, while Kiri stood by, unable to move. If it was underground... The EMT's gloved hands emerged from the dirt, holding what was unmistakably Connor's cell phone. It had bite marks on it, animal bite marks, and a bit of blood. It hadn't been Connor's captors who had brought it to the woods. It had been an animal. If her stomach was in her throat before, it had just entered freefall. She felt sick. She forced herself to think critically and realized the blood could still be tested. "Get it in an evidence bag and I'll take it to the crime lab," she said. The man nodded and proceeded to carry it out of the woods. He radioed his fellow officers and told them to fan out the area and continue to look for signs that Connor may have been near. But Kiri knew what had happened. His captors had thrown the phone out the window as soon as they discovered it was ringing, and the blood had probably attracted the animal. Kiri followed the man back to the EMS vehicle. He sealed the phone in an evidence bag, and Kiri nodded to him. "Thank you." She turned to walk away, and the man said, "We'll call you if we find anything, Lieutenant." She nodded back at him and silently got in the car. It wasn't safe to try to merge onto the highway, so she hovered back to her house, the entire time trying, unsuccessfully, not to think about bullet trajectories. The CSI in her was not letting her forget the scene, though, and she knew that Connor probably struggled with his captors, and then they shot him. She felt a lump grow in her throat and beat it down. "No, you aren't going to cry, at least not until he's found. He needs you to be strong. No crying." What was she going to tell Aiden and Patrick? They've seen the police surround the house. They must know something's up by now, and if Patrick understood something wasn't right before we even got home, even if Aiden didn't. Neither of them had ever seen their parents in pain. She pulled into her driveway and got out of the car. She needed to update her team before she processed the phone, and she was going to process it herself. She walked in without having to show her badge and went directly to the office. Kiri froze when she saw Victor, the trajectory dummy, in the middle of the room. They had named the dummy Victor because it could abbreviate his name to Vic and end up with the same abbreviation for victim. It had been Justin's idea. There were lasers pointing at the spot where the bullet was, leading up to exactly where Connor must have been, based on the blood pool and the bullet's position. "Kiri, you shouldn't be in here," Justin said quickly. Nikki looked up and stepped in front of Victor instinctively. "Well, where was he shot?" she asked a bit shakily. Hans was there as well, trying to assess the blood pool and determine Connor's condition. "In the thigh," Nicky said softly, "and Hans doesn't think it was fatal, though it was a through and through." "It wasn't fatal. The amount of blood doesn't allow for that. It must have missed the major arteries. But I don't need to tell you, Kiri. We have to find him soon," Hans said. "How long do we have?" Kiri asked quietly. "I would say a maximum of 2 days," Hans said. The young man looked slightly awkward as he added, "And I believe he has a concussion as well." Kiri stepped in carefully and looked at the cracked glass on the picture frame. "You found hairs?" Justin nodded. "On the glass," he said. "We'll have the blood analyzed to make sure it's his." "Walk me through what you think happened," she requested, attempting to sound like their boss and not like the victim's wife. "Are you sure you want to do this here?" Justin asked her. "Please, walk me through what you think happened," she requested, a bit more firmly this time. He nodded. "We believe he stood up as he closed his computer, judging the position of the computer, and then he and his captor struggled. The captor probably didn't have the gun drawn initially, which leads us to believe he might have had a false identification at first, and wanted to have Connor leave peacefully. So he's posing as an agent of some sort," Kiri decided, "as Miss Parker and Mr. Greenville did. All right, what else?" "During the fight, his captor must have impacted Connor's head against the picture frame." "Hard enough to bleed," Nicky noted as gently as possible. "At that point, Connor was probably pretty dazed," Hans said, "but he was probably still resisting. They impacted his head at least 2 more times against the drywall, then managed to move back over to the area near the computer." "That's when he was shot," Kiri finished, looking at Victor's position. "We think so," Justin said. "The blood pool indicates that Connor fell onto the chair, stayed there for a bit of time, and then was dragged to his feet somehow, and taken out the door. Probably unconscious," Nicky said. "It would have taken 2 men to lift him if he was unconscious, which explains why the blood trail is so small for the amount of blood here." "So the captor called in for backup, probably. Someone was probably in the getaway car. Greg's interviewing the neighbors right now," Justin said. "What did he find as far as the bullet in the security alarm?" "It was a .45, and the bullet here was a 9mm. That also indicates 2 people." "Connor managed to set off the security alarm?" Kiri asked, jumping to the conclusion that if the man had initially come into the house, someone else had shot the alarm than Connor's captor, and Connor must have been the one to set it off. "But you have panic buttons in every room. This one was depressed. That's probably what initiated the fight between them. We took fingerprints, though. We'll analyze it back at the lab." "No one else would have depressed the panic button," Kiri said absently. "But then why didn't the security company alert the police? Shooting the panel wouldn't shut off the alarm." She wandered out into the hallway. "Did Sarah check in about my kids?" Kiri asked. "She called a few minutes ago and said they were comfortable eating pizza and watching television in our lounge at the lab," Justin said reassuringly. "They're guarded?" "There are 2 guards at the door, and Sarah's with them." "Thanks," Kiri said. "You should go back to the lab," Nicky suggested. Kiri didn't need to be here, and she wouldn't agree to go anywhere else. Nicky knew. "What happened with the GPS locator?" It obviously had come to nothing, but no one had wanted to ask. Kiri held up the evidence bag. "The cell phone was thrown out of a car window, probably because it rang when I tried to call him." The CSIs nodded. "I'm going to process this." Just then, she realized something. "Have you seen Quigley?" "Who?" Hans asked. "Quigley, our beagle. He's just about a year old. Hyper little dog." They shook their heads. "I'm going to find him. Then I'll go to the lab." "We can find Quigley," Justin said, but by then, Kiri had already turned around. She checked first near Quigley's bed. He usually took a nap this time of day. Connor had told her that sometimes Quigley would sleep next to him while he wrote. Thankfully, today was not one of those days. She walked around the house, calling the dog's name. Then when she got to the dinner table, she smiled. Outside, waiting patiently at the door, was her beagle. His tail wagged profusely, and an officer was nearby. Connor must have let him out to go to the bathroom. She opened the door, and the officer looked over to her. "This your dog, ma'am?" he asked. "Yes, that's Quigley." "Hello, Quigley," she greeted him with a smile, and the happy little dog bounced over to her and proceeded to lick her face. She picked him up. He couldn't stay here. This was a crime scene. She'd have to take him to the lab with her, and then she would have to find a place for him to stay the night. "Thank you, officer," she said with a smile, really more thankful for the fact that a small bit of her home life was preserved. "Not a problem, ma'am." Curie took Quigley directly to the car and put him in the back seat. She drove to the crime lab, parked, and carried Quigley in with her. Then she realized that if she was going to put Quigley anywhere, it would have to be in the lounge, and that meant confronting Aiden and Patrick. She sighed. You're going to have to tell them something eventually. They're smart little boys, and they're going to wonder why they aren't sleeping in their house tonight. She walked into the lounge slowly. We'll read more tomorrow.